So the point of today's video journal is to start dissecting some stories. And so I created actually a new channel, or I guess a playlist, just as a place to do that. If my theory is obsessed with stories and structure and the meaning behind them and how that impacts human development and societal growth, then it's important that I am engaging with stories and trying to understand the different ways that they do so. Now, I'll be honest, I am not a literary expert. I mean, there are people who are far wiser in that field than I. But I do enjoy fantasy and stories, and I think that there's a lot of truth in myth. I think one of my favorite quotes of all time exists in a discussion between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, where they're arguing, and Lewis is suggesting that the best way to explain truth is through allegory, and he believes that there's that idea of showing symbolism and allegorical concepts. And Tolkien believes we need to actually just tell an entire myth, that through the myth and through an abstraction and through art, a greater truth can be shown. And we can do that in a far more human way. So for this first one, I want to talk about the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. So there's only 3 books for it out. The 4th book comes out this November, but I think the first 3 parts are very interesting. So I just finished the 3rd in that series, Oathbringer. And if anybody ever watches these, which I don't know if anybody ever will, spoilers, I guess. But so what I find fascinating about this series is at the core, it seems to be a discussion about the concept of power. And so we have these interacting characters that are coming from different levels of power differentials. We have Shaylin coming from what would seem like a powerful family, but they're overshadowed by more powerful systems in a neighboring country that isn't as powerful. And as the daughter of an angry, controlling man, her power is weak, and she has to overcome and figure out how to gain power in herself rather than relying on some type of systematic structure to grant that to her. She has to harness that, especially as a woman in this world. I find Shaylin's story very, very interesting, and gain power through lies and trying to find the equation between the two. When is a lie taking away? When does that distract, and when does that strip you of your agency? And her story seems obsessed with that, right? She's constantly struggling with, who am I? I have gained power, but I have lost something of myself every time I weave it. Of course, most people are going to talk about Cal. I mean, Kaladin is a very interesting and easy to root for hero, even if he is a little bit of a Mary Sue, right? I mean, he tends to be a little bit too perfect, but yet again in his story we see another great example of dealing with power, right? So throughout his entire story, he's dealing with these challenges of, how do I come from none, right? He grows up as a dark-eyed individual, which is the equivalent of an oppressed group in this society. He's poor. His father doesn't really care for power. His father cares for helping people, which puts him at a disadvantage. He's thrust into the games and treated as a pawn and an item by the powerful in his society, the Light Eyes, and he has to figure this out. And so he's actually one that we see interesting is he rejects power, but it's constantly thrust onto him. So what does it mean when we have to deal with power that we don't want because we actually have the ability to help others? And can power be used in a way that isn't corrupt? And this is the question that Kaladin's constantly asking. Is the power itself what is corrupt? Or is that something else, right? Is that something that I can actually wield? And when I do, is it always going to hurt? And so now we have a discussion about that. What I find interesting about Cal is he's the only character with power in the book that is interested in the Parshmen, right? I mean, the vastly more oppressed group at this point, and is willing to understand that. And goes, what make Kaladin group interesting, and this goes back to some of the theory and circle, is Bridge 4 is a perfect example of communal suffering. One of the premises in circle theory is that humans develop connections and social engagement through shared and mutual suffering. And we see this happen in the story of Bridge 4. It is through death and suffering and pain and heartache that they come together and build a connection. And so we find them become close, and they're the best example of that, but the first 3 books are littered with that. Of course, it's impossible to talk about the books and talk about power without talking about the colons. There's very interesting talking about Dalinar, the Blackthorn, and Andalin, however you actually pronounce it, right? And what I find really fascinating is they both have very different perspectives and both gained very differently. The Blackthorn originally earned power through destruction. And it's an example of an old philosophical idea of might equals right. Because we are the strongest, we deserve to lead. And he is the perfect example of that. He is the strongest, clearly, right? I mean, he is built for battle. But his story is actually about learning why that form and power structure isn't right. And ultimately, Dalinar must give up power. He must surrender it to truly gain any strength. And so his strength comes from understanding others in coalition and by handing over. And this is a struggle for him because he's better. He's clearly a more suited leader than his nephew or other individuals. So we see this arc of power being developed. And then Andalin's very interesting, right? His son, who was born a prince. He was born after power was largely taken and held by his father. And he has to play a different game, right? The power of politics, the power ingrained in showing up and in fashion trends, and to play the game and appease the crowd and play this subtle, quippy world of higher social groupings, and how they quip and use honor and all of these things to try to battle in a way that they believe is more civil. And so it's actually very interesting. He's battling with some of his instincts to go, should I just play this game? Should I just allow, should I play this game of short stabs and talk and proud, or should I go kill that guy? Because he is a threat to all of our safety. And this is very complicated for him and a very difficult battle in power. And so I lay this out as just a bit of an overview, but what I find interesting as I note thinking about this series for myself is that the idea itself comes back to what is power? How is it perceived? And what do we do with that? And so I think of all these characters as interacting in different circles, developing from different perspectives of the impact of power systems that are outside of themselves. Yet alone, the world itself in this series is riddled with these ideas of what is power. And it actually connects to another large theme in circles theory, which is the concept of art and of cognitive functioning, right, of the abstract. All power in this world actually comes from. It doesn't come from the war or the conquest. It comes from the manifestation of abstractions in human emotion. It comes from this other world, this reverse, that is born of and is of the emotional connection of the individual species of life, the spren, right? These creatures of honor and spirit, these abstract manifestations that then can interact with our world and feed off of our energy. These ideas of glory and hate and suffering and void and emptiness. And we see this described, I think, very interestingly from the perspective of Wit, which how is Wit not your favorite character if you've read these books, right? Wit is the best character I have read in a long time. Adore Wit. But that's what he talks about at the end of the third book is this idea that of art having meaning. And one of the things I found really interesting is talking about if art is good, it's hated. Good art has to be hated because it's invoking. You know, and he says something to the effect of, it's easy to make something that everybody kind of likes. At least that's what I took from it. I think that's true, right? It's much easier to make motel art, right? There's a great episode of Parks and Rec, right, where they're all arguing about art, and they have Mark come in and he makes a man feeding pigeons in the park because no one can be upset by that in a government building. It's easier to do that. But art is raw because it is an exploration into the abstraction. It is an exploration into who are you? What is our world? What is power and how does it work? And that's messy. And so I think the Stormlight Archive is a very interesting exploration of power. And so I'm very excited to read. You know, there's 6 more books over like the next 12 years. So it's going to be a little while to finish this one. But I think that this is a very fascinating idea. And so we keep coming back to that. And if I was to tie that with circle theory further, it's this idea that if we're talking about structures and how social groups come to engage and interact, then the answer is power is a part of that. And power affects everybody differently. Man, there's some great bits about, so he does such a good job of exploring culture. Right? There's a part where Dallin argues we stripped the women of the blades and they stripped us of reading. I don't know who got the better deal. Right? All of these little pieces about power in a society and how it's divided up, how individuals share and engage that. And so I think that this is, if you want to understand power as an abstraction, I would highly recommend this series. And it's helped me think a lot about that as I go back to working and developing theory of how exactly does this power operate? And how do I operate in it? And that's a very important question. And I think that we all have to understand, because we all come from different levels of power. I think that the character, as somebody who grew up not very wealthy, as somebody who grew up with a bit of a Southern accent that does not go well in academia, by the way. Somebody who comes from a rural kind of Southern culture of trailer parks and food stamps and whatever. I relate to Kaladin, right? I mean, as the dark guy that just wants to help people. I think that's why I found social work. But I've always been engaged in counseling and thinking about how to help people around me. I've always found myself in that sense, but I think that in these books, there's a lot to explore about the individual. So I think that some of and I probably should have taken notes, right? I mean, this is just me speaking off cuff about what I feel after reading some books. So I think I'm going to continue to do this. I want to read some theory next, and so I think I'll make a playlist specifically on some more theoretical works. But I think that the next story I want to read is The Witcher. I'm very curious about it. It's foreign. It's it's got a bit of a Scandinavian feel. There's a different cultural context to that, and it's a bit older. So there's I think it's a bit of a movement in the genre, and I'm very curious to see what themes it will explore. If anybody ever does stumble upon this, I'd love to get your opinion on power in this text, how you think it's discussed and dissected, how it's viewed in different ways. I'd love to have some discussions about Amren and his power and if he was right. Was he right to do what he did? I won't spill any more about that. So I think that these are all important questions when we talk about sociological theory. So I'll wrap up with that because it's hot and my AC is not working, and I will share my ranting lectures to myself again soon.